This is a topic that I know lots of people are super interested in. It's both exciting and at times concerning when you see what is happening with generative AI. And so we're super excited to have some really smart people here to tell us what they're doing and what they think about all of this. Just before we get going, I want to share a quick anecdote. My son asked ChatGPT to write an essay about me. So apparently, I was born in 1983. Sadly, not true. I have a master's from Berkeley. Also, sadly, not true. I was a software engineer at Google. Also not true. And I quote, during his time at Google, Dar was instrumental in the development of several key technologies, including Google Translate and Google Assistant. So. Anyway, so there are a few kinks to work out apparently, but it's getting there. I just want to start by asking our panel members to briefly introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do. Gideon, we'll start with you.
Sure. My name is Gideon Mann. I run machine learning product and research at Bloomberg. I was part of the Bloomberg GPT team.
I'm Anjali Gupta Reddi. I am Chief Data Officer for Dow Jones. Dow Jones, we have several B2B and B2C businesses. We have iconic brands like Wall Street Journal, Barron's on the B2C side. So I oversee the data organization responsible for developing our cohesive data analytics strategy, governance, data engineering, and then AI ML.
Yep. And I'm Paul Walker. I'm an industry partner at Motive Partners. I'm also on their board. I'm also on Mazy's board and on a couple of other boards. And before that, I had a variety of roles at a few financial institutions, including Goldman and DTCC.
Terrific, thank you. Gideon, I'm going to start with you. So for those in the audience who aren't familiar with generative AI, can you talk a little bit about what it is and how it's different from previous versions of AI that we might be familiar with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly everybody calls it generative AI, but I think the important thing is not the generative aspect. I think the important thing is that the way that you interact with all these models is through language. So like to use Midjourney as an example, the way you interact with Midjourney is through language. And that itself is really transformational because whereas 5 years ago, 3 years ago, there would have been a machine learning engineer in between you and the application. Now it's kind of something direct. For the first time in my career, this is something that I can show my dad, and he can have access to it. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
That's great. Paul, what are some of the capabilities that the new technology has introduced, and maybe tell us some of the applications that you're most excited about.
Sure. So look, I think Gideon's point is exactly right. And if you look at the history of AI, you sort of have this 1960 to 2010 period where AI was 5 years from working. And then sort of around 2010, you got it actually 5 years from working. And in the 2010s, we saw image recognition fall, we saw data prediction fall, we saw a variety of other really hard classification and categorization problems fall. And what's happened now is that language, I'm going to put language in quotes, language has proven itself to be amenable to these same sort of machine learning and statistical techniques. And language very, very, very broadly. Right? I think the thing to remember is technology is fundamentally a deflationary force in society. It takes things that are too expensive to do, things that we cannot do, and suddenly makes them doable. And so now there's a new class of thing that's doable, which is manipulation, summarization, presentation, interpretation, and action based on language. It turns out lots and lots of things are language. So if your job is reading 3 papers and writing a summary, well, maybe look for something else to do with your time, because that problem is now solved fairly well by a computer. But not just that, not just paralegals, not just people writing investment memos. Software. Turns out software is very amenable to the same technique. And one of the places I'm most interested in is using this language model to build better software developers. And using this language model to understand software better. And this gets back to this deflationary thought. If you imagine, how many of you have piles of legacy software at your shop where you think you know where the source code is that does something like clear all your US treasuries, right? You don't raise your hand because compliance will be mad at you, but we all know that like our legacy stacks look like that. Perhaps we can actually invest in that with some of this technology finally, right? And lest we think that's lest we think that's not true, we're seeing it happen in other industries right now. We're seeing the rapidity with which software development is changing being really, really fast. And that's the last thing I'd say I'm super excited about, which is things are moving incredibly quickly. Right? I wrote some comments, and one of my comments was a big problem with these generative models is explainability. But literally 5 hours ago, OpenAI dropped a paper about explainability and how they're going to explain GPT-2. And the way they did it is they didn't explain GPT-2. They had GPT-4 figure out how GPT worked and write language about it, right? And like I'm literally, if you read the paper is math and learning, but it's literally that level of analysis is amazing. So I think you all need to sit down and think, where am I not doing things because the sort of semantic barrier is high, it's not a number, or because the content barrier is unstructured, or because the information barrier requires interaction with a person or summarization. I think that those are problems that you can now kind of solve. And that's pretty exciting, I think.
That's great. Well, I don't think there are a lot of paralegals in the audience, but I think when you said the thing about code, it might have concerned a few people. Anjali, can you talk about some of the use cases within finance that you're seeing that you're excited about?
I think in finance, there are so many different use cases. So when I think about, portfolio analysis, investment analysis, and think about the problems you're trying to solve in terms of which customers are your best leads. So lead generation, putting together a 360 view of your customers and understanding upsell, cross-sell opportunities from a marketing standpoint. I think those are really interesting. And then it's like, from a risk management perspective, how do you manage your cash flow? Risk management from a supply chain analytics perspective. So right now, the world is dealing with so much of supply chain challenges. I mean, if you look at General Motors or Mercedes-Benz, you can't get cars because there's certain chip that's not being manufactured in Taiwan. And that chip is so important that you can't deliver the car to your customer because the chip isn't there. And these problems can be solved now with generative AI because you can now start to build your supply chains and understand if a chip manufacturer goes down in Taiwan and that chip goes into a car in Germany or the US, your supply chain is being disrupted. So that's just one example. And there's other examples like fraud detection. You have tremendous amount of data and you can start to see abnormalities in your data to figure out fraud. You can figure out your portfolio analysis, investment analysis, market trends analysis. So I think in finance, the possibilities are unlimited from my perspective.
Super interesting. Gideon, you guys announced Bloomberg GPT recently. Super, super exciting. Can you talk a little bit about the differentiating factors between, let's say, Bloomberg GPT and ChatGPT?
Yeah, for sure. I think it was kind of a surprise that someone who wasn't a big FANG company and wasn't a startup focused on large language models could come out with a language model that was high performant. And so I think part of the lesson for us, and I think kind of generally, is that the technology is within reach and getting closer. And it's possible to kind of be outside of that small bubble and build models. And I think that, there's a blog post, speaking of short time delays, there's a blog post, maybe it was yesterday, maybe the day before, about what is the moat for OpenAI and what is the moat for Google and what's going to be the impact of open source and open source language models. And so I think, of course, part of it is that the technology that you build these models with, the core models are widely known. The optimizers that you use to build them on the large clusters we used, Amazon, as we reported in the paper, you need many, many GPUs, and you need an optimizer that runs over all these GPUs. Those are rapidly becoming widely available and high performant. They still lag, what I'm sure Google, OpenAI has internally. They're getting better. But I think what the piece that we brought uniquely was our data resources, and in particular, our text data resources that we had kind of collected through our data process, through our business process. And those data resources kind of help in a few ways. First, inside of the financial domain, we saw much better performance against models that have been trained in an open domain, against Bloom as an example, OPT 66. And the other part of it is that, by training a model on our data domain and having access at a very low level, we're going to be able to integrate it into our terminal product in ways that it would just be hard to bring another model into. And as a consequence, we're going to be able to deliver very tightly integrated text interfaces into our product. To give one example, which is on the edge of interface and code, to Paul's point, we have a data access layer that we call BQL. It's our API, our new API for getting access to data. It's a very deep language, has a tremendous number of capabilities. Most people only use the tip of the iceberg, a very small amount of the language capabilities. We're going to allow people to write BQL, write these very powerful queries without having to learn all BQL and get them there just much faster. So that tight integration between our data resources and our platform, I think that is the core of what makes our work relevant to our company.
Terrific. And not to put you on the spot, but can you give an example of a kind of question that you could ask Bloomberg GPT where it's just like better positioned with everything that you just described to give you a good answer?
When we think about applications, we're actually really not thinking about them in a chat kind of a context. ChatGPT is a beautiful product. It's so easy to use and accessible. That's not how we're thinking about the technology for Bloomberg. We're thinking about it as a way to augment a lot of our existing product. So it's not going to be, so much of the data that we have is structured data in databases, data that's real time. I don't want my language model to remember, a P to E ratio. That's not relevant to have in the model. Instead, the way that we're going to use it is we're going to use it as a gateway to all of the data that we have internally. The BQL as an example. So you can imagine the flow. You ask a question, the model recognizes that you're looking for some piece of data that's in BQL. It'll issue the BQL query and then return that in the generative process, in the inference process. So anything that's real time, not really a great thing for the model to remember. Better to have the model write a little snippet of code, pull it into our real-time databases, and deliver it to a client.
Awesome, thank you. Paul, as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. What are some of the responsibilities you feel that providers of this technology have to ensure safe usage?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a whole incredibly interesting field of ethics and computer science now dealing with what are the limits and ethics around AI, and we only have 15 minutes left, so I'm not going to go into that too deeply. But I think in financial services, we want to remember that we are still responsible for the actions that our computer programs take, right? If you write a computer program using ChatGPT that realizes or using any large language model that realizes the best way to increase sales to customers is to present information to them fraudulently so they buy products that they shouldn't. The fact that you used AI is not exculpatory, right? You're still getting fired. Your boss is still getting fired. Your boss's boss is having a meeting with their boss about the $700 million fine. And most importantly, you fraudulently sold a product improperly to someone, right? So as we deploy these technologies, we need to make sure that the same controls we put on anything we would do using previous technologies around safety, security, compliance, regulatory adherence, those things happen. And I think they're going to be harder to put in place. They're going to require some real thought about how you actually implement that on some of these models. Because the explainability is getting better, but it's not super high. And the attractiveness is very, very high. So I think it's a real, if any of you are thinking, this is great, I'm going to go use a large language model to do X, Y, Z, and you're not thinking that you're also talking to, legal and compliance, obviously, but also someone who thinks about what the customer experience should be, and someone who thinks about how that's going to be intermediated, right? I talked about software development. I think a lot of the best results we've had with software development is not replacing people, but making people 5 times more productive, right? I think for a long time, at least until, for a long time, I was going to give a time scale, but then I realized that's insane. For a long time, we're going to still need people in the loop for so many of these things until the technology becomes invisible. And then the last thing that'll happen is the technology will become invisible, it'll become baked into the operating part of our lives, right? How many of you have a phone number of a dispatcher you're going to call to get a car service home who's going to lie to you about where your car is? None of us have that anymore, right? Uber has made all that invisible, right? And so this technology will similarly become invisible. And when it becomes invisible in that regard, you need to think about how do you maintain it, how do you make sure it stays working, how do you make sure it stays meeting the needs. As you add new data to it and train it again, how are you making sure that data is still not doing something that you don't want? Because the responsibility for the actions of this technology are still with us, right? We have not crossed an ethical line where we're placing responsibility as an independent actor on a computer today. And I think that's appropriate. And so I think there's an awful lot of not just ethics, but also professional responsibility that we have to take when we use these incredibly powerful technologies. They're incredibly powerful, incredibly seductive, incredibly useful. And if you get them wrong, you've, mishandled a chainsaw, right?
Anjali, can you share your thoughts on this as well, please?
Sure. So I think, some of the things that Paul mentioned, right? So with these technologies, from my perspective, in my mind, I think the data aspect of it is really important. Like, what data are you putting in? Because you're actually taking the data and putting it into another environment. What are the do's and don'ts around the usage of the data, the fit for purpose? So that's one aspect of it. Second is cybersecurity. So, some of these technologies can enable a lot of, fraud and cybersecurity related issues. The third would be the do's and don'ts of what are you creating with this? So a lot of fake, it could be fake news, fake content, fake images, the text to speech. We're seeing a lot of this happening now. And certainly, AI has been in use since the 1960s. But suddenly, over the last few years, we've seen, or rather last few months, we've seen a lot of this, videos being created with Kate Winslet's voice, or some celebrities' fake images being. So I think all of that needs to be taken into perspective. I think that the laws and regulations are way behind, and the technology is actually going on at an exponential speed, but the laws are not keeping pace with it. So I think it's incumbent on each of the companies and people that are in the data analytics field or in the product or the UX areas where these technologies can be used. You kind of need to be the gatekeeper. You need to work with your legal department. You need to work with your compliance folks and put together some guardrails and guideposts for your company around what can be done, what cannot be done. And that's applicable to your software developers, UX folks, your product teams, the data and analytics teams, which are creating the models and creating capabilities around this, large language models. So I think it's a tough challenge, and I think we've just taken a couple of steps into this journey, and we have to be really cautious of what we're doing.
Yeah. Gideon, by the way, if you want to add to this, great. But I was going to switch topics. Do you want to add to this one?
No, I'm good to switch.
Yeah. Just curious to get your thoughts on how this changes the nature of work and how people work. Talk a little bit about that.
I think it's I was reading the other day that one of the effects of technology over the past few decades has been around distribution, and so the consequence is that you get an increasingly steep pyramid where the best performers are able to, Ed Sheeran is able to sell out every single stadium that he goes to, and kind of massively replicate his success in his performance. And a lot of the benefits of the technology haven't gone to people who are starting out in their careers, people who are weaker in intellectual areas, or in case of music, and weaker musically. I think one of the surprising things about the technology is it begins, by having another brain or some kind of a brain that you can integrate into your workflow that actually works against a little bit of the return to merit effects of this distribution in ways which are interesting, and so that, maybe people, I was reading about a call center example, and in the example that this work talked about in the call center, people who are starting out in a call center got the most return from the integration of AI into their practice, which is surprising. Usually technology, it has kind of given accretive effects to the people at the top mostly through distribution. So I think that it's not clear, but there's a real potential that there are different effects on the whole labor pool, and different parts of the labor pool are advantaged using AI.
Yeah, and look, Mazy, no theory in economics is worse than technology destroys jobs in aggregate, right? We have the most people, the most technology, and the most jobs at this moment in time. But technology definitely changes what jobs are and what they can be, and I think that's another thing we need to think about responsibly when we roll out this technology.
Yeah. Anjali, just as we're wrapping up here, can you tell us maybe what you're most excited about with this technology in the future?
I think it brings a lot of possibilities for us. So while we need to be cautious and wary, this is the first time, and it's a moment in history. AI was in the hands of more B2B businesses, enterprises, but now it's democratized, right? Like, it's come into the hands of all the consumers. You can, kids in schools, in middle school, they can start to use ChatGPT. So this is, I think, an important moment in history. I think it will lead to a lot of creativity for music producers, creative people, in terms of videos, audio content, movies, what have you. Second would be, in our industry, I think, personalization. So the possibilities around, giving you personalized recommendations around what you'd like to read, what content do you want to absorb, what do you follow. So I think the Netflix and the Spotifys of the world, that'll become very, very democratized. Third would be that, it's amplifying human intelligence. So a lot of the repetitive tasks are going to go away, like, summarizing documents, editing, and people would want to focus on more creativity. So I think it's going to amplify the ability for folks to focus on more creative things, whereas the mundane tasks are going to be handled by generative AI. So in my mind, I think as we keep an eye on misuses, the possibilities here are really immense.
Yep. Paul, how about you? What are you excited about?
Well, look, first of all, I don't know what's going to be the most amazing thing that will come out of this, and so I'm excited to find out what that is, right? If I knew what it was, I would go do it. And in some ways, right, I think about the sort of collection of AI technologies we've had in the last 5 years as being the same sort of order of magnitude as internet, transistor, germ theory, printing press, right? And so I don't know what came out of those. Like those are kind of cool times to be alive. So that's pretty exciting. But I think immediately we're going to see many of the things that we want to do around information, many of the things we want to do around content, become easier, more fun in some cases, less tedious in others. And I think that's going to create a large number of really exciting new companies. I'm excited to invest in some of those. A large quantity of really exciting new products that I'll use. And frankly, a bunch of things that are invisible that just get better, right? We're not going to be calling dispatchers. I'm not going to have to look for a music recommendation because Spotify knows what I like. Right? I'm excited for all of that. But what I'm really excited for is to look back on this 30 years from now and realize that we were at a moment in history and I paid attention to it and I saw how it played out.
Very cool. Gideon, how about you?
I think personally the opportunity to change how science is done and how we're able to understand the world and how it operates. I am super excited. I think when people talk about AI, a lot of time they focus on a lot of the the ethical problems and the ethical concerns, and I wonder what people's reaction to the car would have been like these days. If people would have been worried about accidents and people driving too fast or driving drunk, and said, "Oh, maybe let's not do a car altogether." But I think ambulances, fire trucks have been amazingly good, and they're just the ability to move faster. Advanced science, advanced knowledge has been a huge boon. So I think I'm very excited about the advancement of human knowledge as a result of AI.
Fantastic. Well, look, we could spend at least a few more hours talking with you guys and not exhaust this topic. Thank you so much. This was really terrific.